Hey guys, in this video we're gonna take a look at a specific case of how we can use grammar to help ourselves learn languages through immersion. And the specific case we'll be looking at is going to be English verbs. So we're gonna be looking at how the verbs work in the English language. However, the general principles that I'll be going through in this video will also be applicable to other languages and also to other areas of whichever language it is that you might be learning. So it's not just a video about English verbs, it's a video about how you can use grammar to help yourself immerse efficiently and effectively. So before we get into the main part of this video, I wanted to explain one very important thing about what this video actually is, like the nature of this video, you could say. So I was thinking about two use cases for this video, so how one might use this video to help themselves learn a language or multiple languages. So this video is for someone who has already been learning the language for a while and wants to clarify certain things that they have already seen in their immersion, and they want to be able to see those patterns more precisely and analyze what they have already seen from an intellectual perspective, which might bring out certain part of immersion and help you make more sense of it, thus making your immersion more efficient, because by analyzing your input you can also improve your ability to recognize those patterns in the future when you immerse. So it always comes back to immersion, but the grammar is just a tool. So I've already talked about this on this channel before in the video, which I believe was called why grammar, as in why use grammar at all to help yourself learn a language. So I'll link that video in the description. So now that I think about it, there's actually kind of three cases that you might take a look at. So the first case is just in a learner who has been using immersion to learn the language, but just wants to kind of just take a look at the patterns from an intellectual perspective to make immersion more efficient, just like I explained. So the two other use cases that I thought of were just kind of curiosity, so just to satisfy your curiosity. So maybe you already speak English fluently, but English is just an example, again, like in this video. It can be any language. So say you speak your target language fluently already, but you're just curious about how it all works, so you might want to take a look at grammar, and by doing that you might also learn some things, or notice some things that you haven't noticed before, which might help you kind of make your language better in some way. So you might see things in a new way, which might make you even more fluent. So there's that case. And then also there might be some learners who have been learning a language through traditional methods, where you have a grammar book with exercises and all of that, and such learners tend to accumulate a lot of mistakes in their language through their learning, because they are using a lot of translation in their head, which is not the way to go. That's why immersion is very important. This is actually the key to learning a language. That's how you acquire the language. And we'll talk about language acquisition in this video a little bit, but maybe I'll make separate videos talking about that in the future. But that's essentially a process of how your mind naturally acquires the language, which is, you might think of a baby who is just picking up the language from their environment naturally. So that's what language acquisition is. And that's very different from learning the grammar rules and then kind of trying to translate stuff in your head and then apply those rules. That's just not how it works naturally for humans to learn the language. So that method tends to have quite bad consequences for language learners, in that they start saying things wrong because of how they're used to doing it in their head through translation or through some other way which was not like, it's not something that they heard in the language and then repeated like in a language input that comes from a source such as a movie, for example, a podcast, something that was just made by the speakers of that language, and that's how the language actually works. So if you pick up patterns from that, you get the language as it is. But if you do it from a grammar book, you might just construct something in your mind which is not actually how the language works. So for such learners, looking at the grammar might be helpful as long as they start immersing. So if such a learner starts immersing at a later point, they might still have a lot of mistakes in their language, and in that case, revising the grammar from a slightly different perspective, like a way that I'm going to be doing in this video, might clarify things for them and make it more clear how the mechanism actually works. So that might actually help to kind of dismantle those errors that they have been making because of the traditional language learning methods. So I'm gonna be talking about why those traditional learning methods can create such consequences as we go through the content of this video. So now, without any further ado, let's just go over to the computer, and over here I have this article that I wrote, and I'll link this article in the description to this video, of course. So yeah, I spent quite a long time preparing this because I wanted it to be, I wanted this article to go alongside the video, so you could pretty much go either way. You could read the article first and then watch the video, or you could watch the video and then read the article, or just do one or the other. So they kind of complement each other and probably work best together. So, but I'll be using this to just to give examples and just to structure this video in general. So this article structure will be pretty much the structure of this video as well. Okay, so let's see. So over here in this introduction section, I wrote that we'll be looking at the forms of verbs as a system. So I say that we'll be looking at all the different forms that the verb can take, but also we'll be looking at those forms as a system. So the system part is important, that's why it's in italics. So why is that important? So if you look at grammar rules in isolation, it makes no sense at all. But if you look at them as a coherent whole, then it all makes sense. And that's one of the things that I'm trying to achieve with this tutorial, is to show how the entire kind of system of English verbs works. Because if you just look at specific cases, that only shows you things, how they work in those specific cases. But like I said, the system, look at taking like this bird's eye view, the big picture view, helps you put those little things into perspective. So I'm not going to be focusing on the little things because there's been plenty written and said already about those things. Like in traditional methods, you can like look up all the specific cases of how like each tense is used in the language. So in this video, we're going to be taking a look at the general picture of how all of those things, like all the different tenses and all the different verb forms, work as a coherent whole all together. So, and that will put all those things into perspective. So this is a video about this general perspective, the bird's eye view. So the next point that I want to make is knowing boundaries of a system. So what do I mean by that? So when you have a bunch of rules which go pretty much like seems like forever and there's no end to it, that is not going to help you to make sense of your immersion at all. But if you have an isolated thing which you know how it works inside itself, that like those boundaries of that thing create a sense of control, essentially, that you know how that part works really well. You just know the entire mechanics of that thing. And that is really what you should go for when you try to use grammar as a tool for to help you to learn languages through immersion. So I came up with this metaphor that grammatical categories are like suits and ranks in a card deck. So what are grammatical categories? So they are, for example, things such as person, number, tense, and there are also other grammatical categories that verbs have, which you might not have heard of. They're called like aspect, mood, and voice. So those are all part of this system of English verbs. I'll be explaining those things a bit later in this video, but right now just kind of know that that every single verb can change forms, but it changes forms according to those grammatical categories. And those grammatical categories are, in a way, like suits and decks and suits and ranks in a card deck. So when you pick a card from a deck, it's not going to be something completely random and unexpected, but it's going to be one of those. You know, it's going to be either hearts. Hearts, spades, clubs, and diamonds. So it's gonna be one of those four suits, and it's gonna be one of the ranks like ace, 2, 3, 4, and so on. So it's not gonna be something completely random. You already have an idea of what you'll be getting once you pick a random card out of that deck. So the same way when you are immersing, when you're watching a movie, for example. Once you know the system, like you know these boundaries of the system, you know what you might get, because it's just gonna be one of those things. It's gonna be a combination of certain grammatical categories, the same way you get a combination of a suit and a rank when you pick a card from a deck. So hopefully this makes sense, and I'll probably come back to this metaphor at some point to kind of clarify how it works specifically. But in general, this is the idea. This is what I mean by boundaries of the system. So it's a defined set of things, and you know which kind of dimensions that set has. So by dimensions, I mean here again like suits and ranks, like those things, grammatical categories: person, number, tense, aspect, mood, and voice. So those are the 6 categories, grammatical categories that verbs have, and those are like their suits and ranks and so on. It's just like with the card deck you have 2 dimensions, like only suits and ranks, but with verbs in English you have 6 dimensions. So that's a way of thinking about it as a system, and that's why I'm talking about boundaries, because it's not unlimited. It's not just like a bunch of chaos going on there. There is like some kind of order there. So that order is what we're trying to understand. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and scroll down over here to this base concepts section, which is going to be essentially, in this section we'll take a look at different concepts that we need to understand in order to understand how the actual system of the verbs works. So we're going to go through some terminology here, some concepts from linguistics, and yeah, that's what we're gonna do. So I'll just go ahead and jump right in. So the first thing is what is verb? What is a verb? So and like what is the essence of that part of speech? What is it about? Like what does it allow us to do? So I like to think about it in the following way. So verb is the part of speech that allows you to make a statement. So This is like the general way you might want to think about it. So by making a statement, I mean something essentially that can be. You can think of a statement as something that can be either true or false. So you are asserting something. So that's what you do with verbs. That's what verbs allow us to do. There are some caveats to this, but we'll take a look at those in a second. And yeah, they essentially there's still a good reason to think about verbs as the thing that allows us to make a statement. So that phenomenon of making a statement, it has a name, and it's called predication. And I explain what it is kind of in this section of the article. And yeah, this is just kind of the name for that process, essentially. We're not going to focus a whole lot on this because it's explained in the article, and I kind of just want to go through the main points pretty quickly, so the video is not too long. But you can read it, and this will explain what it does in more detail. And I also noticed, or I also mentioned that sometimes there are some caveats to verbs being the thing that allows us to make a statement. So sometimes you can have a verbless predicate. So the predicate is just kind of the part of the sentence which does predication, which usually has a verb in it. So like, for example, here, I visited my friend. Visited is the predicate. She is my friend. Is my friend is the predicate, and like there's the verb there. I'm not going to explain the whole thing about the structure of predicates because that's not what this video is about, but just know that that's what it is. So you can have predicates just consisting of a verb, or a verb with another part which is called a predicative expression. So that's the second type, and there's also a third type, which is a verbless predicate. And in English, it only occurs in certain varieties of the language, so it's not very common, but it can be very common in other languages other than English. So that's kind of the reason why I included this here. So here there's an example here from English of a verbless predicate. But yeah, we're not gonna spend too much time discussing this. I just recommend you read the article, and you can also take a look at different links that I have here, which will point you to like more stuff. The links are mostly to Wikipedia, so it'll give you more kind of information on those things if you're interested to learn more. Okay, so next concept. In this video, we're going to be discussing properties of different parts of speech, even though we're talking only about one part of speech, the verb, but it's going to be relevant kind of discuss properties of different parts of speech because verbs have forms that have properties of other parts of speech. So let me explain what I mean by that. So let's first take a look at what types of properties we can observe in the language. So we're going to be talking here about nominal versus verbal properties. So here we have some examples of parts of speech which are nominal in nature and which are verbal in nature. So here we have a noun which is like the prototype of that contains like all the nominal properties. And the verbal properties are like the verb is the main part of speech that has those properties. But other parts of speech can also have properties that kind of are resemblant of, for example, nouns that have nominal properties. Like, for example, adjectives. They have nominal properties because adjectives, first of all, modify nouns. It's like, for example, here, a frequent flyer. Here, the noun flyer modifies, or the adjective frequent modifies the noun flyer. So that's one thing. And to fly frequently, in this phrase, the adverb frequently modifies the verb fly, or to fly, yeah. So adverb is a verbal modifier in the same way as adjective is a nominal modifier. That's why I classify them in such a way. So other parts of speech that have nominal properties are, for example, pronouns, which are like I, you, he, she, it. All of those things are still referring to something in the same way that a noun would, but the referent can change essentially. So it's partially, the part of it works the same as nouns do, but there is also a part that is unique to that part of speech. So that's why we have a separate term for it, pronoun, but there is a lot of nominal nature to pronouns. So that's why it's kind of helpful to compare those to kind of see the relationships between the parts of speech, and that will be quite important to understanding verb forms as well. Let's see. So there's also another class of properties which are adjectival properties. So those are properties of adjectives. So you can think of adjective as the base for that set of properties. Kind of go from there. And I also said that adjectives are nominal in nature. So they have both properties, like they have nominal properties, but they also kind of are there are other parts of speech that have properties of adjectives specifically, so that's why it's helpful to also think of those as a separate thing. Like for example, here we have a phrase, the first time. So this first is a numeral, so it's called an ordinal numeral. So those are the numerals that, like first, second, third, that show order, and it behaves like an adjective, but it's not just an adjective. It's a numeral. It's a separate class of words which we call part of speech. But yeah, it has adjectival properties which are very obvious because it's used exactly like an adjective. And there will be verb forms that are also used exactly like adjectives. So that's why I'm going through this. So the first time. So first behaves like an adjective. And here we have an example of verb form, a flying bird. So flying is a participle one of a form of the verb to fly, but it works exactly like an adjective again. So this form has both verbal and adjectival properties, and also nominal properties, because adjectives have nominal properties. So those things kind of go in this way. Like if you program, they work like classes in programming languages essentially. So this might make sense to those who program, but just kind of get this idea that that parts of speech are kind of share properties with one another, and you can take one part of speech as the base and then kind of look for those properties in other parts of speech which are kind of related to that part of speech. So those are the three classes of properties that are important for us to understand: nominal, verbal, and adjectival. But you could also talk about, for example, pronominal properties, like properties of pronouns, and you can find those in other parts of speech, but we're not going to go there because it's not relevant to this video. So let's see. The next thing is synthesis and analysis. So there's two ways in which word forms get created. So first of all, word forms are essentially forms of the same word, which is pretty obvious from the term, I guess. But like you can just think that like there is a main a main form, which you can see just in a dictionary, for example, and then that same word has multiple forms. So, and those forms can be made in two ways, either synthetically or analytically. So, synthetically, when a synthetic form is a form that has a change within the single word itself. For example, if we think of the verb to play, a synthetic form is plays, for example, like he, she, it plays. So that's a synthetic form. But an analytic form is a form that is constructed by adding helper words to that main word. Like here, for example, we have the form is playing. So the main word is still to play, the verb to play. But we're also using the verb to be as a helper word. It's called an auxiliary verb, which is like the term that you probably heard if you ever studied English grammar. But that's just a kind of helper word in an analytic structure. So two types of forms, synthetic and analytic. That's what we need to know. And then there's also these terms which you might come across: inflection, declension, and conjugation. So essentially, inflection is what this form plays does. So it is a change in form by adding a suffix, for example. So you say that a word inflects. Here we have more examples of this. For example, here is an example of a noun, like dog and dogs. So dogs is the plural form, but that's also an inflection of the noun dog. Now there's also two other terms which are declension and conjugation. So declension is inflection of nouns, and conjugation is inflection of verbs. So that's the only kind of difference between them. There is a lot of kind of mess surrounding these terms, which I explain in this article again, so I'm not going to go through that in a whole lot of detail, but there is like peculiarities about how those terms are used. But basically what is important for us to know is that so we said that conjugation is inflection of verbs, and we also were talking about synthetic and analytic forms. And so for verbs, the term conjugation tends to be used to refer to both synthetic and analytic forms. So it's all conjugation, and that's the way I'm going to be using this term in this video. But like at the same time, since we said that declension is inflection of nouns and conjugation is inflection of verbs, the term inflection is not used for analytic forms. So that's a bit of a mess there. It's kind of like asymmetric in that way. It would be nice if it was different, but it's not. So I explain this in a whole lot of detail here, and I give a lot of links to different things that you can take a look at if you're interested. But what's important for us to know is just that conjugation is referring to both synthetic and analytic forms in this tutorial. Yeah, and that's usually how this term is used for verbs as well. So let's see. We're going to be talking about paradigms in this video. So a paradigm is a complete set of forms of a given word. For example, a verb. So if we take a verb, all of its forms, like all of the possible forms of that verb, is its paradigm. So here I have two examples of partial paradigms, because the full paradigm will be very large. And yeah, I just wanted to give a short example, so it's quite small. I only showed the person and number for one specific tense and aspect and mood and voice, but we'll get into that later. So it's just person and number. Let's just say in the present tense to like use a simple term of a verb to play, and so this is a paradigm. And here's just another example of a Latin verb, just to show that a paradigm for person and number can actually be quite different in other languages. Like in English, we have very limited set of forms, very limited conjugation for person and number. But in other languages that might not be the case. You can have separate forms for each person and each number. So here's an example for Latin. So yeah, that's paradigm. So within the paradigm, there's one form that is picked traditionally within each language. Each language has its own tradition, but within the paradigm, one form is picked as the base form, which is also often called the dictionary form, which is the form that is used in a dictionary to look up a word. So for English, it's the infinitive form of the verb, so like to play. And in dictionaries, it's just play, so you don't use the particle there just to be short. But yeah, the base form is the infinitive. And well, it's not really just to be short, it's just that there's two ways in which you can like use infinitive, either with the particle to or without. When you use it without, it's called bare infinitive. Bare as in naked, right? So without the two. So that's the base form or dictionary form. Those are synonyms. And there's also one other thing worth knowing is the term principal parts. So principal parts is the set of forms from which all the rest of the paradigm can be derived by using rules, essentially, of grammar. So that's, and I have here, let me see, yeah, here I have this frame that kind of talks about how principal parts is primarily a lexicographic device, which means it's something that is used to here I have it explained actually, concisely represent verbs paradigm in a dictionary entry. So it's just to give you like the entire paradigm in the most compressed form, essentially. That's why it exists. So in traditional language learning methods, people are taught things like to write, wrote, written, to play, played, played. So those are the principal parts of those two verbs, like to play and to write. But there's no point in really trying to derive the entire paradigm from that in your head. It's just a way to represent that paradigm in a dictionary. What you should do instead, you should immerse in your language as much as possible, and you can observe part of that paradigm. You can find them in your immersion. And then eventually, through that massive exposure, you'll get an intuitive sense of how everything fits together, and you won't need to learn all of those things. You won't need to try to derive every single verb form from those principal parts. It'll just become obvious because you've listened, or you've listened to that language a lot, or like watched videos in that language a lot, to the point where it just becomes intuitive to you. So that's why I have this this explanation here, because like I said, language acquisition is something that happens through immersion, and it does not happen through learning grammar rules. So that's a very important point. So again, like, I'm explaining all of these grammar terms, but we need them to understand the system of how verbs fit together. But I'm not doing it so that you can kind of analyze your way through to fluency. It's not gonna work. It just won't. It just doesn't work that way. The only way that you can really become fluent is through immersion. And you have to listen a lot and watch a lot, and eventually you'll get there, and you can use grammar as a tool to help you along that path. But you cannot learn a language by analyzing it and trying to kind of construct it in your head, because you'll create something other than the actual language. You have to immerse and observe it over and over and over again until your mind gets so used to it that it will become natural for you to speak it. So that's how it works. Okay, so lexical and grammatical meaning. Each verb form expresses both lexical and grammatical meaning. So the lexical meaning is the meaning that is described in a dictionary. So that's the lexical meaning, like the proper meaning of the word itself. And the grammatical meaning is the part of the meaning that is expressed in a sentence when you use the word in a sentence. And it's expressed by those grammatical categories that we talked about. So person, number, tense, and so on. All of those things express grammatical meanings. So, for example, a meaning of something happening right now, or something happening in the past, or something happening in the future, or something being done by the first person or the third person, or something, or there being more than one of something. All of those things are grammatical meaning. So here I have a few examples to kind of try to visualize this, like which part of the word carries lexical and which part carries the grammatical meaning. So for example, here it says like Alex plays guitar and writes songs. So in these verbs, we have this part that carries lexical meaning, like play, and this s ending carries some grammatical meaning to show that this is the third person that is being talked about. So the same way in the second example, I'm playing guitar right now. So am playing is the entire form, but within that form, only the play part expresses the lexical meaning, and am playing like this. This part expresses grammatical meaning, that expresses the meaning of it being a continuous action in the present moment. So that's lexical and grammatical meaning. Yeah, we'll leave it at that. It's probably pretty clear. So let's see. Next thing, finite versus non-finite verb forms. So we talked about predicates, right? That's the part of the sentence that that expresses that like assertion, that making a statement thing. So there's two kinds, like each verb has two kinds of forms, finite and non-finite. So finite forms are those that can be used in a predicate, and non-finite forms are those that cannot be used in a predicate. So and non-finite forms have properties of other parts of speech. So that's what we talked about with nominal, verbal, and adjectival. So for verbs, their non-finite forms have properties of other parts of speech, and specifically here we'll see how those forms have nominal and adjectival properties. So let's take a look at a couple of examples to make it clearer. I chatted with my friend. Here we can see a finite form of the verb to chat used in a sentence in the predicate to like assert, to make a claim that I chatted with my friend, right? So, but in the second example, chatting is fun, we use another form of the verb to chat, but we're using it the same way you might use a noun, like, I don't know, guitar is a musical instrument, for example. Like I'm using guitar there in the same way that chatting is fun, that the form chatting is used in this sentence. So we can clearly see it's not that form's nominal properties here in this example, because it is used in the exact same way as a noun would be used. And so that class of forms that this form belongs to is called non-finite forms, because this form can never be used as a predicate, as a part, like as the main part of the predicate, in the same way that you can say I chatted with my friend. So yeah, that's finite versus non-finite forms. Here we have also a few other examples of non-finite forms. For example, I like to study. Here is an infinitive form acting as a noun. Studying is fun. This is a gerund form, again working as a noun. So gerund is basically a noun, but just just derived from a verb, right? So studying is fun. A studying person, studying is a participle one, which functions as an adjective. We already had an example like that. And the studied chapters, it's a participle two, which again functions the same way an adjective would. It modifies the word chapters. So those are some examples of non-finite forms. And another important function of non-finite form is them being used in analytic forms. So remember, we talked about synthetic and analytic forms. So synthetic forms are those that have a change in the word itself, in the word form itself. So for example, to play, plays, so that just the word itself changed. But analytic form, we use a helper word to construct the entire thing. So there's multiple words in an analytic form, right? So, and here we have a couple of examples of that. So I am studying right now. Am studying is the analytic form, and it has a participle one, a non-finite form used within it. So that's another important function of non-finite forms. And another example, I will study tomorrow. So will study is the analytic form, study is an infinitive, and so yeah, it's again functioning as a part of an analytic form. So that's why that's another way that analytic forms or that's another way that non-finite forms are important. So there's two ways that they're used, like this, as just a separate entity, essentially, as the same way that a noun or an adjective would be used. I like to study, studying is fun, a studying person, studied chapters. Or they can be used within an analytic form, like this, I am studying right now, I will study tomorrow. So now we have gone through this base concept section. If something that I explained wasn't quite clear, I recommend you read through this section. It's not that long. Or yeah, I don't know, your mileage may vary on this, but I tried to explain things here very clearly and gave examples. So that should clarify any question that you might have. But hopefully my explanation was good. So these are the concepts that we need to understand in order to actually understand the English verb system. So now let's jump in and take a look at grammatical categories of English verbs. So there's gonna be, so we talked about person and number already, but from this point on we're not gonna be talking about them anymore, because like we saw in this example here, conjugation for person and number is very limited in English. So we'll just be representing those forms concisely. For example, I might write here, I have a footnote explaining this somewhere over here. Let me see. So here, yeah. So this is how we're going to be representing conjugation for person and number. Just S in parentheses, which means either play or plays, or just like this with a slash. Am, are, as, have, has, where parentheses don't work. So we're not going to be focusing on conjugation for person and number anymore, because it's very limited in English. And it's actually worth focusing on the other remaining four categories, which are tense, aspect, and mood and voice. So those are the ones that we'll be looking at right now. So let's see, tense. I'll be explaining tense in a way that you might not be used to, but just bear with me for a second. It'll actually the traditional picture that you might be used to will emerge from my explanation. It's just that my explanation will be a bit more detailed. So let's just take a look. So basically the category of tense has two binary oppositions. We have past and non-past, and future and non-future. So it might sound a bit complicated, but it's really not. Because like when you see it this way, so we have non-past and non-future, and that gives you present. Non-future and past gives you past. Non-past and future gives you future and past give you future and the past together. So those are two binary oppositions that give rise to 4 cases of tense in English. So that's that. Just bear with me for a second. I promise there is a point to it. And so then we have aspect. With aspect, we also have 2 binary oppositions. We have non-perfect versus perfect, and we have non-continuous versus continuous. And those give rise, again, to 4 cases: simple, perfect, continuous, and perfect continuous. And so those 2 things combined together give rise to a tense aspect system, which you might be used to seeing in like grammar books and stuff, which is shown in this table. I'm not gonna recite this entire thing because that's a lot, but it probably makes sense to you right now. So here on like horizontally we have aspect, and over here vertically on the side we have tense. So here are all the cases that arise from from the combinations of these 2 binary oppositions. So in total we have 16 cases of tense and aspect. But tense and aspect are 2 separate categories. So that's kind of the point that I wanted to make. So you can take a look at it in more detail, and I personally find when I break it down into like its minimal components, everything starts to make much more sense, because this is quite a big like thing to try and get into your head. But when you break it down small like this, then you have all the cases, and then you just know that all of those cases can combine with each other. You don't really need this table. It just shows you what emerges, like what arises from from those combinations. But once you know kind of the base, like the underlying parts of it, all of this becomes intuitive. So yeah, that was the point about that. Then mood and voice. So mood and voice are different. They don't work like that in binary oppositions. They are actually in either or relationship. So there is no like combinations like this here where you can have perfect and continuous aspect together. You can just have one mood and one voice out of these options here. So for mood you have indicative, subjunctive, conditional, and imperative. And for voice you have active and passive. So for moods, I'm not really inclined to go into a whole lot of explanation of what they are, but let's just give a few examples to clarify what it is really briefly. So indicative mood is like the normal mood that you would use. For example, let's take some example from here. Like, I am playing guitar right now. So this am playing is an indicative mood. It just indicates something. So that's why it's called indicative. And subjunctive mood is a mood that expresses kind of supposition. For example, if I were playing guitar, that would be cool. So that were in if I were as a subjunctive mood form. You might notice that it's not was I was playing, if I was playing, even though you can say that as well. But were is like a more traditional subjunctive mood form, but in the modern language, was is used just as well. Yeah, so that's basically how it works. In English, subjunctive is kind of less important than in other languages. For example, if you were learning in a language like Spanish or French, subjunctive mood is quite prominent there, and it was almost exactly the same as like a structure. This structure in English works. The example that I just gave, like if I were if I were playing guitar, that'd be cool. So that thing works exactly the same. And subjunctive mood has sort of like a very closely related mood, which is called conditional. So that second part of that sentence, if I were playing guitar, that'd be cool. That would be cool, like would be is the conditional mood form. So they often go together, subjunctive and conditional, in those kinds of sentences, which are called conditional sentences. But like I said, like grammar explanations are not the point of this video. The point here is just to take a bird's eye view of the entire verb system in English. So that's as far as I'm going to go on that explanation. Hope it made sense. If you'd like to learn more about subjunctive, what you can do is just go ahead and open up Wikipedia and search for subjunctive mood. And let's see what we get. And so here you can find English and under Germanic languages. And here is they have a separate article on English subjunctive. And over here there's a whole bunch of different examples which you can take a look at. So subjunctive is not only used in conditional sentences like in the example that I just gave, but yeah, there's also other cases. So you can take a look at those cases here in this article. I guess I'll leave a link to this article in the description as well. So let's see. So that's subjunctive, and where were we? And the fourth mood that we have is imperative. So that's just the command form, essentially, like play guitar, as in like, yeah. Like play guitar, as in I want you to play guitar, right? So that's the imperative mood. So that's what those are. And active and passive, well, you probably like know those. Those are pretty easy, like play versus be played, right? I'm playing guitar, the guitar is being played by me, like all those stuff, all those things. So yeah, should be pretty clear. So now we'll take a look at the actual forms that English verbs have. So we'll start with synthetic forms. And over here in this table, I have a few examples of synthetic forms of verbs. So here I have principal parts of verbs, of several verbs listed. So we have here our two example verbs that I already mentioned, but these are the two examples that I'm going to be using: to play and to write. And also, by the way, one thing I kind of didn't mention, there's two kinds of verbs in English. So in traditional grammar books, they're often referred to as regular and irregular verbs. So for example, the verb to write might be referred to as an irregular verb because it has like this form wrote in the past and written as the participle too. But like in other Germanic languages, like German, Dutch, Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and others, the terms that are used to refer to verbs such as to write, for example, they use a different term, and I think it's a better term. So instead, these verbs are referred to as weak verbs. Like to play is a weak verb, and to write is a strong verb. And so the reason why I prefer those terms, because the verb to write is not really irregular. It actually does follow a certain pattern. It's just that in English those patterns are really like just due to the way that the English language developed specifically, like as opposed to other Germanic languages. Those patterns got pretty blurry, and there's not a lot of point in kind of trying to pick them out, like, and kind of look at those verbs in groups of like look at the strong verbs as like having a pattern. You might just want to sort of like memorize it, like the way that they do it in traditional methods. But at the same time, I prefer to use the term strong verbs because that allows us to talk about not just English but other Germanic languages as well. So I'm going to be using the terms weak and strong to refer to these classes of verbs, and the terms regular and irregular are I'm going to reserve for cases like this. For example, to be is an irregular verb because it has a completely irregular pattern which doesn't follow any pattern. It has like forms that you can call like random. They're not really random, but there's no regular. There are no other verbs like it, you could say. So that's why it's irregular. And you can kind of, if you go like deep into language history, you can find weak verbs that are regular and weak verbs that are irregular. So just a weak verb, but it has some deviations from the general pattern, and so that's an irregular weak verb. And same thing for strong verbs. So most strong verbs just follow a pattern, but some of them don't, and they are thus irregular. So there's actually like, so there's weak regular, weak irregular, and strong regular and strong irregular. But that kind of analysis will actually help with other Germanic languages. With English, it's less important, but I thought I'd still mention it because this tutorial is supposed to be for like applicable to many languages, not just English, and using English as just an example. So let's see. So we have here two example verbs like weak and strong, to play and to write. And here we have a few other verbs, and the reason why I have these specific verbs here is because these are the verbs that we will need to use to form analytic forms of these verbs, or like of any verb actually. So these are our auxiliaries: to be, to have, will, and to do. So here you can see an interesting case where will is a verb that does not have an infinitive, it doesn't have a participle too, it only has a present tense form and a past tense form. So these verbs like this are called defective verbs, or you can also say that they have a defective paradigm. So those are the terms that are used in linguistics. So these are the principal parts, and but these are not all synthetic forms that these verbs have. And here in this other table, I have all the synthetic forms listed. So these are all the possible synthetic forms. So these are the forms that only use one word, and the form that word changes. For example, by adding a suffix like s or ed, or the vowel in the root of the word might change, like write, wrote. Yeah, so those are our synthetic forms. So let's see. So hopefully these forms are kind of recognizable to you, because like I said, this tutorial is aimed at people who already can speak the language or have a significant amount of experience learning it. That's why this video is in English as well, by the way. So it's not like, if you cannot understand what I'm saying, you're probably like, there's no point in going into this much detail about grammar for you at this point, because you should just immerse until you kind of get there. You might like take a look at grammar, but like analyzing it this deeply might not really be optimal unless you are really interested in linguistics, in which case you might want to do that. I actually sometimes do that. Well, pretty much all the time. When I'm starting out with a language, I like to read the theory, but I understand that that's not for everyone, and a lot of learners would prefer to just engage with this with sources that they like watching favorite shows, favorite movies. Those things are much more enjoyable, like for a lot of people who are not into science of the language as much. But if you are into linguistics, like pre-learning theory can actually help. But in order to do that, you need to kind of understand the terminology and be able to just kind of parse all of that information fairly quickly, so that it's not just a whole like lot of analysis again, because that doesn't help. Immersion is really where your main focus should be at. So yeah, that's how it is. Let's see. So we have our synthetic forms. So these are all the synthetic forms of these verbs. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 synthetic forms. Actually 9 if you like count gerund participle 1 as separate things, but they always have the same form in English. But it's worth thinking about them as separate things, because like after all, gerund, the meaning of the gerund is the meaning of a noun, as in playing, like I don't know, singing is fun. That's like a noun, but a singing person, that's like an adjective, so that's a participle. So gerund is like a noun participle, one is like an adjective, so that's why they're different. And like historically, they used to be separate, like they used to be different in form, but then they kind of merged, and the form became just this one. So yeah, that's how the language developed historically. And in other Germanic languages, you will have different forms for gerund and participle. So that's why it's worth kind of thinking about them separately. Like another reason why you might want to think about those things, those two forms as separate things. So let's see. So now we'll take a look at how we can derive all the analytic forms just from this set of forms that we have here. So over here at the top we have our auxiliaries, and here we have our two main verbs as examples of a weak verb to play, and a strong verb to write. Okay, so I came up with this system when I was a university student, and it really helped me a lot to just kind of comprehend this entire thing about how verbs work, and just be able to kind of come up with any form in my mind easily, because it really follows a very clear pattern. So let's take a look at this. I'm going to explain what all these diagrams mean. So this first form is kind of a separate thing. So I'm going to start with talking about it first. So it's called do support, and this form is what you see often in questions. For example, as in like, do you play guitar, for example? This do play is the do support form. So it's that form is the same as the present tense, but it uses an auxiliary verb to do with an infinitive play together in that question form. You can also use it in an affirmative sentence as well, like I do play guitar. For emphasis, you might use do support there. And so do support is only used in simple present and simple past. So those are the only cases where you see do support. And so those are different from the rest of the analytic forms, which we'll take a look at in a second. Okay, so now let's take a look at the second part. So I call these things building blocks, and the reason why will become clear in a moment, because these four actually can be combined. So at first, well, let's just take a look. So this is the future tense, or like, let's just think about them as building blocks for now. So this is the future building block. It has the auxiliary here, will, and then it requires some form of the main verb to follow it. So this future building block requires an infinitive. So will plus infinitive. So from play you get will play. From write you get will write. So the next building block is perfect. The perfect building block has had the verb to have as the auxiliary, and it requires a participle to of the main verb after it. So play, have has played. Write, have has written. So that's perfect. Then continuous, you have be plus participle 1, play, mr is playing, write, mr is writing. And for passive you have be plus participle 2 as opposed to participle 1 here in continuous. So that's play, mr is played, and write, mr is written. So this is how you can construct those separate forms for like future perfect, continuous, and passive. But there are also more complex analytic forms which are formed by combining these building blocks together in this exact order: future, perfect, continuous, passive. That's the order that they go in. And so the way you combine them is you put the next block after, well, say future and perfect. You put perfect after the future, and you put the auxiliary of the following block into the form that is required by the previous block. So over here I have some examples. Oh, actually I have this exact example here. So future and perfect. So we have will, which requires an infinitive after it, and we have perfect, which requires which has have as the auxiliary. So we have to put have into the infinitive form, which happens to be have, and we get will, this bit. Then we have, which is the infinitive form, and then we put the main verb at the end in the form that is required by the last block in the chain, which is participle 2, played. Same for the verb write, we get will, have, written. So the blocks are always combined in this order. And let's see, so another example, like say we want perfect and passive. Say we want a perfect passive form. So to do that, we take the perfect and passive blocks and we skip the other ones, but we maintain the order of them, of the blocks, and just proceed as though there was no gap here. So we get like the first auxiliary have, then we have it requires participle 2, perfect requires participle 2. So the next block is passive, and it has the be as the auxiliary. So we put this auxiliary in this participle 2 form, we get have been, and then we put our main verb into this form, which is required by the last block in the chain. So played, have been written. So this is how it works. Here's another example with 3 blocks. Works exactly the same way. Will plus infinitive. The next block is perfect, which has have as auxiliary. Have in the infinitive form is have. So we get will have. Then be in the participle 2 form is been. We get will have been. And finally the main verb in this form that is required by the last block in the chain, which is played, and we get the entire form will have been played. And finally, we can do all the 4 blocks. I'm not gonna explain it all over again. So you put the auxiliaries in the form that is required by the previous block, and you get this long form will have been being played. So So the whole point of this is that the entire system of analytic forms, analytic verb forms in English, arises out of all the possible combinations of these blocks. So this is how you get from synthesis, from these synthetic forms to analysis. So this is how you can take like these synthetic forms and then use them to construct analytic forms. That's how it works. And it works pretty much the same in other languages. English is actually quite special because it has this pretty long chain of 4 blocks. I don't know any other language that has 4. I think I know one that has 3, yeah. So this works for other languages as well. This system, like for example, in Norwegian, you also will have a similar thing. There's just fewer blocks, or like in German, in any language that uses like analytic forms like this, it'll have something similar essentially. So this can be applied to other languages as well, just with some modifications. So, and now we can finally have the entire paradigm of any given verb available to us by knowing all this stuff that we just talked about. So the last section is called all forms, and let's see. So we have this big table that shows all the possible forms. So let's just kind of talk about this table to make sense of it a little bit. I guess I'll zoom out to make it kind of fit better. Yeah, like this, for example. Maybe like this. Okay, so what do we have here? All the like columns and rows, or like, yeah, all of these headers are clearly labeled over here. So here on the left we have mood. We start with the indicative mood. Voices are active and passive over here. Then we have tense. So we have tense described in terms of those binary oppositions, as well as the traditional cases that arise out of those binary oppositions, that the thing that we talked about in this section above on grammatical categories about tense and aspect. So there's that. So we have the aspect over here horizontally. Again, same thing, binary oppositions give rise to 4 cases. And here in the main part of the table, in the cells, in these cells we have our 2 example verbs, to play and to write, and all their forms listed for all the possible cases. So for example, here you have those do support forms, play plays, do does play, write writes, do does write, and for the past tense as well here, played and did play, and wrote and did write. And so these do support forms only happen here, never in no other part of the table do they appear. So and the rest of the forms are formed by combining these blocks that we talked about. So you can just kind of see how it is done. So here is a continuous form. So you just kind of take a continuous block, where is it? Like continuous, be plus participle 1, and you put the verb to be in the present tense form, and then you follow the block's guidance, and you put it like the main verb into the participle 1 form. I guess let me split this view to show this all together so that we don't jump all over the place. Okay, this will do. So as I was saying, we want the present tense form here, so we put the verb to be in that form, in the present tense form, which are listed over here in the synthetic forms section, we have like all the synthetic forms that we can possibly need. Like all of them are listed in this table. Yeah, and so you just use that form, and then follow what the building block says. So participle one, we use participle one of the verb to play, playing. We get MR is playing. Bam, we have our present continuous indicative active form. So yeah, so that's how that works. Let me see. So for example, we have, so why is it indicative? Because here it says indicative and we have here present indicative form. So just thought I'd explain that. Okay, so let's take a look at some other parts of this table. So here we have the active voice, then we have we scroll down, we get to passive voice, which is essentially the same 16 cells as over here in active, forming those forms by using those building blocks. Over here you might see like those most the longest forms with 4 blocks over here. So all of this is formed that way. So the best way to understand this table is to just kind of explore it and try to construct those forms by using those building blocks, and it'll make sense. So yeah, so this is indicative mode. We had active, 16 cases of this active, and we had indicative passive, and for subjunctive we have fewer cases, so we have here active and passive on the left, you can see that. And so let's see, for subjunctive, let's try a subjunctive form. So for subjunctive, let's say we want this one, past subjunctive. We're playing. So we want, so this is, I gotta scroll back, but this is continuous. So we want past continuous subjunctive active, right? So over here in analytic forms, we have our subjunctive of the verb to be over here, were. So we use that, we're playing. So you might use this form in a sentence as in like, if I were playing guitar right now, like that'd be cool, or something like that, right? So that's an example of this subjunctive form, just in a sentence. But you construct it again, so you take to be in the form that you want, past tense, were, and then you get your building blocks section here, and we want continuous. So again, be plus participle one, be is in the subjunctive form, were playing, so you get were playing. This is different from the indicative form, which is was were playing. So subjunctive is always were, like traditionally, but nowadays just the indicative form is often used instead. But I have it here for completeness sake, and also to just make it easier to make links with other languages. For example, like in Spanish, you will have, like over here, if you were to apply the same system to Spanish, you would have a subjunctive form here, which is which is different from indicative and always used. It's not like in English when you can just kind of use indicative instead. So I just like going like getting the most detail as possible in these cases. That's why I have the subjunctive here listed as like this strictly subjunctive form. Okay, so we have these forms for subjunctive. so for subjunctive over here it says NA, which stands for not applicable, and what is not applicable is the future part of the future tense. So subjunctive, there's no future subjunctive in English, so that's why this section has only 8 cases per voice. So eight active voice cases and 8 passive voice cases, whereas in indicative we had 16 of each. So same thing we have here for conditional. Here we have even fewer distinctions. We don't have past or non-past either, so we don't have any tense distinction in conditional. We only have the mood, the voice, and the aspect, both continuous and perfect over here. And for imperative we have even fewer forms, only 4 cases. We don't have any perfect imperative forms. We only have continuous for aspect, no tense distinction as well, and yeah, so mood and voice, active and passive. So these are all the imperative cases. So this table covers all the finite forms, and for non-finite forms we have this separate table over here, which shows the forms for infinitive, gerund, participle 1 and participle 2. So this column here, so this table for this non-finite forms table has the same structure as the finite forms table, with one difference. This column on the left, there's this added column on the left which says verbal. So I wanted to explain this a little bit. So the term verbal is essentially, it means almost the same thing as non-finite form. So verbal is a form of a verb that has characteristics of other parts of speech, like we were discussing, like properties of other parts of speech, nominal and adjectival specifically in this case. So we've been using these terms, finite forms and non-finite forms, to refer to specific forms of a verb. So for example, a verb to play. So this is a finite form of a verb to play, and this is a non-finite form of a verb to play, but this is also a non-finite form of the verb to play, but both of those are forms of infinitive. So I prefer to reserve the term verbal to refer to those groups of forms that we call like infinitive, for example, because infinitive has 8 possible forms. Same thing for gerund and for participle 1. Participle 2 has only 1 form, actually, it doesn't change at all. But so the term verbal, this is how I use it personally. So it means this group of non-finite forms of a given verb. And also you can think about it of a verbal as a sub part of speech. It's sort of like, it's kind of like a verb. It is connected to the verb, it is derived from it, but it also stands pretty well on its own as its own thing. Like, as in, for example, like a gerund works exactly the same way as a noun. So you can say that a gerund is kind of like a subcategory of a verb, essentially. It's like if you imagine a tree, you have like verb, and then you have a branch underneath it, like a folder that says verb, and in that folder 4 other folders which have like infinitive, gerund, participle 1 and participle 2. And those are kind of similar are in a sense like parts of speech, but they are still connected to the verb. So that's the way I use the term verbal in this tutorial. And it kind of makes a lot of sense, I think. So let's see. So this table is much smaller than the finite forms table. And it should be pretty clear by now, so I'm not really gonna explain a whole lot here. Hopefully it makes sense to you. And yeah, this is pretty much it. So I'm gonna go ahead and end this video here. I've been recording for 2 hours, so that's been quite a lot of work, but I'm glad that I made this video. I've been planning to do it for quite a long time, and yeah, I've been writing this article for weeks now, so I hope you like it, and I hope it helps your language learning, and I also hope that it helps you make sense of your immersion better, so that you can like observe those patterns that you can now have a better idea of from analyzing the grammar and taking like this intellectual look at the language. And so hopefully that conscious knowledge will help your unconscious mind absorb the immersion better. So you have a better tool now to deal with your immersion essentially. And that was the goal of this video. So this is it. Thanks for watching. Leave me a comment to let me know what you think, like the video if you liked it, and subscribe to the channel if you'd like to see more of my content. And if you like the content and you'd like to support me, you can do so by joining my Patreon or by leaving me a tip on Ko-fi. So this is it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.